So it's going down, ready to start anytime you are here.
Oh, I don't know. My people came to Missouri in 1835 in a covered wagon and settled down in Christian and Greene County. My immediate family settled in Greene County, but the other Howards, this was the Howard clan, they settled in Christian County. And on the James and Wilson Creek in 1835, and my family are living on the same hill, same piece of ground that they settled in 1835, and they're living there now. It's the sixth generation living on that same spot, and they are descendants of the Howard family. And when they came to this country, the Delaware Indians were quite active there on the James and the Wilson Creek, and that's where James and Wilson gets their name. The Indians named the creek, the two creeks, because they named them there was a man, a white man, that they loved very, very dearly. The Indians did, and he lived with the Indians and was one of them. And they liked him so good, they named the two rivers after him. James by his first name, and Wilson by his last name. And so that's the way the two rivers got their names, from the Indians. And when I was a girl, I went down there to live with a cousin, and she took me to this Indian graveyard across the bluff, across the James River, and there was little mounds all over the bluff there.
Up on top of the bluff?
Yes, and they, of course, none there today because people have gone in there and dug them down, dug them out. But at that time, 50 years ago, they were there, and very plainly. And the Delaware Indians hunted and fished all along the James River from Wilson Creek clear down several miles below. That was their hunting ground. And there was a church, but the white men built a church there on the river, and it was called the Delaware Chapel, which is still standing but has been moved up off of the river. And they have, and there's still a trail around the hill that we travel now, the school bus and the mail route, and everybody else travels this, and they go around the hill off Highway 14, and that's known as the Delaware Trail. And all this information I got from my father and from my cousin, and they told me that I've been always interested in those kind of things. And
now you know where the piers are for the original, the first bridge that went across?
Uh-huh.
All right. Where was this graveyard in relation to those?
Right up over the hill. You see that where those piers are now. There's a big bluff right back of. Well, on top of that bluff was where the railroad, or was where the cemetery was, and
that's
and there was a man bought a tract of ground up there about 4 or 5 years ago and built a very, very fine home, and it's a man that worked, one of the managers at Hoffman Taft, I believe, and he built a fine home. He bought that land there, and I think that goes down to the river. And then another set of the Howards came. There was 3 of the Howard family came from North Carolina, and the other ones settled out here on what is I think it's the Blue Springs. It's where baseball, this Major League Baseball man, Reiber, I believe, was that his name?
Reba.
Well, he built this fine home out there, and that's built right on the very spot where my grandfather, my own grandfather, built a home. And it's right up on the top of the hill from the spring there. And my grandfather lived there and raised his family there.
Then you went, you grew up with lived with this cousin, was that it?
Yes,
Mrs.
Mrs. Kerr. She was a Phillips, she was Rosa Phillips. And I grew up down there until I got ready to go away to college. Then I went away and I taught school in that county and also in Greene County. And,
now, did you have some relatives that lived close to where the Wilson Creek battlefield is now?
oh, my grandmother lived just west of the Wilson Creek battleground. And grandfather was going to war. And now this is a rumor, but I think it could be true, but it was a rumor I have been told by another relative that my grandfather was one of the pilots that piloted General Lyons. He stayed all night in Springfield the night before the battle. And my grandfather and some other men directed him down to the battlefield. See, General Lyons was from Connecticut. He was from the east, and they didn't know the country, and they took him down there. And my grandfather was in the Union Army, and my grandmother lived alone all that time with 7 little children, and they had to. And a cousin then moved in with her. That didn't have my grandmother had plenty, and this cousin moved in with her with 4 or 5 children. So they spent the time that way in the war together. I don't see how they all got along. We couldn't do it today. But when my grandmother, just after the war, my grandfather passed away. Just immediately after the war was ended, and my grandmother had all these children to raise. And she did it in such a beautiful, she was really a pioneer. And she made all of their clothes. Every bit of their clothes was all homemade. And my father was married in homespun. I have a picture of a beautiful picture. Just looks like it was tailor-made. And my grandmother grew the sheep and everything and made that wool suit for him. And
you have a lot of other family heirlooms. You have some handmade
coverlets.
Yeah.
And the coverlet that I have is, I don't know how much it would be worth if I was to go to sell it, but it would be worth quite a little bit. And it's very rare. See, it was made before the war. My grandfather rode horseback to Rolla, Missouri, to buy the dye, to dye the wools and the flax. And she even grew the flax in her garden that made the warp of all these coverlets. And it took Grandfather 2 weeks to go and 2 weeks to come back. Boy, I don't see how they made it. And grandmother had 7 children, and when each one of them married, she gave them a team and a cow and 40 acres of ground. And today I can go down there and pick every one of those 40s out. My father showed them to me. 40 acres of ground, and I wonder how many of us today could do that.
Now their homestead was west of the battlefield.
West of the battlefield.
Over Double Z now and on
and
down.
We used to have a man here, Mr. Swan, who was in the, didn't he have he had a store here. Mr. Swan and another man had a store here in town. I think Mr. Swan and this other man were baseball players too, as well as I remember. And he bought my, recently, I don't mean recently, but in the last 15 years, he bought my grandmother's home, and it's very much like they built a new house there, but the ground and the trees and the surroundings is very much like it was in her day during the war. One of the finest homes in Greene County, and it's listed in the history of Greene County. Somebody wrote 2 volumes of the history way back there, and my grandmother's farm is in that, listed in that,
and the name's Howard?
Yeah, my grandmother's name was Howard, but her grandfather's name was O'Brien.
O'Brien?
Yes, O'Brien. He was Irish. He came from Ireland, and but she was a Howard. She was a cousin of the ones that settled down in Christian County. And my grandfather bought that piece of ground there, that home. It was just ground. He built the home, log cabin, and he bought it in 1850. And the deed was made out in Washington, D.C.
Now, it's going now. Now let's start when you were, your earliest memories when you were a small girl then.
Well, my mother died when I was 6 years old, and nobody seemed to care very much about me. The relatives didn't, and for a while I lived with a stepmother, and then I went to live with my cousin, who was very kind and good and very interested in me and seeing me make something out of myself. And I went to this little country school that down in the Christian County, the Bennett School, and it was named after one of the pioneers there. And we had every grade in one building, and the teacher managed the whole thing. I don't see how she did it, but she did. And then when I left there, I went to, after I got through the 8th grade, then I went to the Springfield High School, Central High School, which is now, and then from there to an old normal school, which is now SMS. And then I went back to my native Christian county to teach. But I taught my first school here in the edge of Springfield, out in the west part. And then I went back to Christian County and I taught in the Clever Junior High School. And I had some interesting experiences. I still today have 4 or 5 of my former pupils who have done well. They really have gone. I have one man and his wife who live in Twin Falls, Idaho, and he has a big lumber yard and doing well financially. And I have, they still say I'm the best teacher they ever had. It's wonderful to have people say that. But just got a letter since Wade went away. And then when we had everything to do ourselves when we were teaching. We didn't have somebody to fire the furnace and bring in everything. We had to do it ourselves. The teacher was supposed to, and I used to pick up and down the railroad track. I had about a quarter of a mile. I walked down the railroad track before I got to my school, and along the way I'd pick up little pieces of railroad ties that was rotten and worn out. To fix my fire when I got there, I had to make my own fires, and if the stovepipe fell down, I had to put it up.
What was the name of the school you
taught? I taught at Bennett School, where I had gone to school.
Oh, where you had gone to school.
Yeah. And
do you remember the first school at the edge of Springfield, what the name of it was?
I taught out here on the Wilson Creek Battleground. I taught my first school in the country after I left here. Out there, it was the Forgot Capernaum, I believe that's the name of it.
Oh, yeah.
And it was right on the very edge of the battle, well, it's battleground now, but it was on the very edge of the battlefield and on the railroad track. And one morning I went in I always locked the door, but, you know, locks aren't very good. And one morning I went in, and then we had what we call tramps. They were just harmless as they could be, but they were just people traveling through the country on foot. And I went in one morning early to build my fire, so I'd have my room warm for the children. And when I went in, I had a hall, a little double hall. Went in one door, and then over there's another door, 2 doors. And when I got in, there was a tramp, and he'd come in there to stay where it was warm that night. It was cold weather. And he brought a lot of hay in there and made him a bed. And I wasn't afraid. And I asked him what he was doing and where he was going. I found out all about him. And he was this harmless person, just traveling around.
Well, this school was down
Yeah,
where the battlefield is
yes,
now.
it's right across the railroad track from the old Ray house.
Oh.
It was right on that hill, just across the track from the old Ray house. And then from there I went in and into the clever schools, and I taught there until 1923, and I quit teaching.
Now back to the Delaware area there. Do you remember hearing them talk about how large there was a large Indian village there? I know.
Oh yes, it reached the whole. It reached from Highway 14 clear back up past Wilson Creek. It was just a gathering place there of the whole Delaware tribe. It was quite. There's a lot of Indians there.
It's been a large village.
Yes, it was one of the large Delaware settlements.
Well, now when you were a girl down there, do you remember who are the people you particularly remember that would be kind of typical of the early Ozarkians? That they, of course, you still knew some that had settled there at that time.
Well,
of course, there were no cars or
no
radios.
No.
I guess.
And no telephones at first.
Yeah,
No,
that's right.
just didn't have any way of communication. And people were all happy and contented. And we didn't have any robbing. You didn't ever have to lock up anything because there's nobody stealing.
And everything was pretty well self-contained. Now, they weren't still using natural dyes then, were they? The stores, the towns had developed enough to where you could buy store dyes.
Yeah, when I lived down there,
that's what
but
I mean, yeah.
during the war and just before the war, they didn't have any. My grandmother didn't make any of her dyes. Some of the earlier people did make their own dyes, and as they did back in the East, around Williamsburg and all there, in their earlier times they made their own dyes, but my grandmother didn't, because she used the factory dyes.
Well, what things do you remember that, like your grandmother was still doing, that of course are lost arts now? What are some of the things you remember seeing her do?
Oh, I remember seeing her weaving, and we have the loom that all that weaving was done down on the farm now. I wish we could get it out. I wish we could have a museum where we could put things. Because when I'm gone, I'm afraid that loom will be...
yeah, because these things disappear in a hurry. Yeah.
And then they would sit up at night. My father told me about, and his sisters, he had 4 sisters, and they would sit up at night and knit socks. See, all their socks were homemade, home knitted. And Father said that the girls would knit a sock in the evening by the fireplace, at a big fireplace that heated the whole house. And my grandmother, the next morning after the battle was fought, it was started in about 9 o'clock, and it was a very, very hot day, 10th of August, and grandmother, the next morning, after the battle, there was so many men killed, I don't know how many there was. The ground, they said, was just laying thick with dead men. And the next morning, my grandmother had quite a old-fashioned house, but it was a big house. 3 two-rooms and then a big room in the back and upstairs, too. And the next morning, after the Battle of Wilson Creek, Father said that my grandmother's 2 big front rooms were just laying just as thick, just like sticks of wood, of wounded soldiers that they brought there out of the heat. And
you remember now they had reunions up until I think the 20s or so. Do you remember ever seeing the veterans come back and walk over the battlefield?
My goodness, I can remember as a little girl, Father would always take us over to the reunion, you know, and they'd make a kind of a picnic out of it too, you know. And then I can remember seeing the soldiers, the southern soldiers and the northern soldiers. They didn't march together. The northern soldiers marched in front, and then the southern soldiers come in behind, and I can just see them just as plain.
And they all visited them and rehashed the battle more or less.
Yes, everybody was friendly.
Both sides, everybody was friendly.
Was friendly, and they'd have big speakers off from here, you know. They'd come there and speak and all, and it was quite an event. They had it every year.
Where did they have these gatherings? Do you remember where? Was it right where Lion was supposed to have fallen?
You know, yeah.
Do you remember the rock pile that was there?
I sure do. They're there now, though.
No, they've been gone now.
I know that everybody's carried them away. I have a beautiful one. Do you have one?
Yeah. Wade gave me a piece of one. Remember, he made it as a paperweight that was made from a rock.
Well, I've got a beautiful, just one left out in the garage, and it is a beautiful thing. It's about this big, and it's just as smooth and pretty, and he's got written on it August
10th,
1860. And then another interesting thing down in that part of the country and down at Clever, and some of his people are still living there now, and that's really something. I'm proud of my war ancestors. I'm not proud of them because they were defending the country, but there's a family living down at Clever right now. A Hart boy, his name is Kenny Hart. And Kenny's great-grandfather was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
Now that's something.
That's something.
And I read the other day about all the different signers. I don't know what, that was it. I belong to the National Historical Society in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And I think that's where I read it in one of my magazines they sent. And it told all of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were nearly all wealthy people. They were the best educated they had at that time, and probably most of it. And it told what Hart had. He was a great landowner, owned so much land there in the East. I believe I forgot what state. Massachusetts, I believe. And he was one of the. But when he went back home after the war was all over, why, he didn't have anything. His family was gone, and his wife had died and all. But this Kenny that lives down there now is one of the great.
Yeah.
About second, third generation.
Now, back when you were growing up down there in the Delaware area, as a young girl, you had play parties. Didn't you go to play parties?
No.
No. They didn't happen at the houses?
Well, they had them, but I didn't go to them.
Oh.
It wasn't because the other day this little boy lives out in this part of the country. I expect you know him. He wanted to go out to the mall. Last Saturday. He wanted it. 2 other little boys. He wanted to go out to the mall and wander around Saturday afternoon. His mother wouldn't let him go. She told him to stay at home and watch the ball game. And when his father come home, there are people who, are raising their children like they should be raised. And the little boy said, "You thought you don't have any confidence in me. And the father says, oh, yes, I do. I have all confidence in the world in you, but I don't have any confidence in the other two boys. And so that's the reason we didn't want you to go there. You see, and that was the way my people were. They, what did they call
Well, what? Well,
they weren't for me. And my Mrs. and my cousin didn't want me to go to those things.
Well, what did you do for entertainment then?
I went to Sunday school and church,
Uh-huh.
and that's it.
Uh-huh.
And
now, did you play games and that type of thing? And do you remember anything?
Well, not too much, because there wasn't too many young people around there.
Uh-huh.
So and I was perfectly happy. I was perfectly happy to have a home and have somebody like she was that loved me. And I was perfectly happy to stay at home. And then, after I got to teaching, I bought a car. Then, didn't hardly anybody have cars, but I had a car. But I didn't drive it very much. I drive it to church and Sunday school. And I would go in clever sometimes to church. But I just didn't run around. I didn't want to.
Now, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about your teaching. You started, we'll start here. You started in 1912 here in Springfield, and then you went down to Capernaum on the Wilson Creek battlefield. And how big were your classes then? How many grades did you have?
Oh, I had all the grades as long as I was in the country.
That's 1 to 8.
Yes, 1 to 8. But we would we'd double them up, and teach the 8th grade every other year, and teach the 7th grade every other year, and that way we only had the 4 grades, Well, we had to have we had the little ones, you see.
Uh-huh.
That way the county superintendent had us to do, and that way we'd only have not as many.
Was
grades.
the first grade 6 years old like it is now?
Yes, and the other ran to around. Depended on if they just kept on going to school, and they never. Then very few of them went away to high school, and when they would they would just go to school and then they'd stop.
At what age? About 13 or 14?
Yeah, about 14 or 15.
How long was your term?
Well, usually 6 to 8 months.
Started in September or?
No, yes, or August.
Now, did they sometimes cut it short? Or did some children not complete the whole year in order to work on the farms? I've heard reference to that before.
Wasn't a strictly special farming,
How big an area did your district, your particular one school cover?
I don't know that.
How far did they think? Probably 3 or 4 miles was about as far as any of them. Well, that'd be as far as they could walk.
Oh yes, yes. And I walked too. I didn't ride. I walked. About 2.5 miles.
Every day, to and from. And you had a big pot-belly type stove?
Yeah. Oh, those old big stoves, and they did make good heat. We burned wood,
Now, into your higher grades, what would be your average, say for the 7th and the 8th grade, what would be your curriculum? Pretty much the 4 hours, in other words.
Yes.
Did you ever have any unusual experiences while you were teaching? Everything pretty well went pretty smooth.
Everything went as smooth as could be. The last year I taught in Clever, I always did something for my 8th grade graduating class. See, I taught 1 year down at the Pierce School, 2 years down there, at the Pierce School down southwest of Clever. It's a 2-room school. I had the 7th and 8th grades there, and another woman a girl had the other. And
P-E-A-R-C-E, like?
P-E-A-R-C-E.
Named after the Pierce family down there.
After the Pierce family. And everyone, as I say, when they finished the 8th grade, and they graduated from the 8th grade, and it meant just as much to them as it did when they went away to high school and graduated from high school. And I'd always give them something. Then when I went to Clever, I had just the 7th and 8th grade, just the 2 grades, the junior high, and kept teaching them just. And so, one year, the last year I taught, I was going to give the children a picture of their class. And, I'm about so big, I guess what. We drove to Billings, went to Billings to have them made. The photographer there was, and that was when Pretty Boy Floyd was running wild. And I went in the bank, and my Uncle Jack Howard, said, "What are you doing here?" He was school day, and I said, "Well, I brought the children out to have their pictures made, my 8th grade class." And he said, "Well, I had a class that had been detained 2 years in 1 grade there in Clever. And so there, you see, I had children that should have been up in high school. And they were great big boys. Laura Little was one of them. And Uncle Jack says, "Well," he says, "when you get back home," he says, "I think we'll put you on trail of the Pretty Boy Floyd. They're trying to find him. He's running wild." Yeah. So when you get back home, we'll put you on trail of him. If you can get back with these children, these boys and girls, well," he says, you really have accomplished something." And so I did. And one man wouldn't let his daughter, take his car unless I'd ride in it. If I'd ride in his car, he'd take his car. And I had a little car. I bought a little car, and I let 2 of the boys ride in my car, and so we managed and got back all safe and sound, and everybody was happy.
Well, now, were children required to go to school then, up to a certain grade like they are now?
Yes.
It was the law then?
Yes, it was the law.
Do you remember having any,
No,
because that is a law that had just been enacted. You didn't have much trouble down there,
no.
did you?
No, we didn't have a bit of trouble.
Well, now that brings up a point too. All this, the tourist idea we have about the lazy, shiftless Ozarkians. You always see pictures of them laying under a tree with their moonshine bottle and all that. Now, what's your opinion, since you were raised as one and amongst them and everything? How would you contradict that?
Well, I just say it isn't so, because I didn't see any of it. I mean,
everybody was pretty busy with what they had to do.
Yeah, you had to make a living. You didn't have a government check coming in every month, and you had to make a living yourself. And you see, we didn't have any income tax then. I never had to pay any income tax in all my teaching, because the law wasn't passed.
The community pretty well looked after each other, didn't they? If somebody's house burned down, or if some family really became impoverished because the breadwinner died or something like that.
That's right. The people took care of their own people. And we didn't have any rest homes, and we didn't have old people put off on somebody else to take care of. They took care of their own people. And,
well, how self-sufficient when you were living with your cousin? What things did you need to get from town, like Nexa or Springfield or Clever or something like that? You pretty well, as far as eating, you raised.
Well, we raised everything.
Everything you ate, really, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
It would just be material things like
things that that you couldn't raise yourself. Oh yes, everybody raised and canned and put up. And when we moved, there's just the 2 of us, just Wade and I. And when we moved to Carthage, we moved 600 cans of canned fruit. Oh. Just Wade and I. And I was just a little old girl. I believe it.
People kept busy, didn't they?
Yes.
Idle time, as we think of it now, being bored, in other words, it just wasn't.
We didn't have to get up and go somewhere. We took pride in our homes. And we took pride in making a home. And after I was married, I never did teach anymore. I could have taught, had a chance at the time. I had a chance during the war to teach, and I was giving me an awful big salary down in Carthage in Jasper County. I said, I've got a full-time job right here keeping my man happy. And he was happy always. We did. I just felt like that was my task. And,
now, how was in the early days, your medical care? You had doctors, didn't you, in the area down there?
Oh, we had the country doctors.
You remember who the doctors were in the area around Delaware?
Yeah, Dr. Williams. He was such a nice person. And then we had Dr. Wade. And next day they had Dr. Lawson. They were all, yeah. I don't think people went to doctors then like they do now. They didn't have to. We didn't have the pollution. We didn't have the, we had pure air and pure water, and everything was, I don't think we had sick people. I can't remember my people ever being sick. Colds, but that'd be all. There were still, of course, a lot of home remedies used. I don't mean for serious illness, but I mean for other, what were some of you Yeah, the
remember
little
now?
old kids. A lot of them had come to school, you know. And they had around their neck a little cord, and then on the end of it was a little something tied up in a rag, little about that big, and that was acidity. And they'd chew that every once in a while, and boy, it did stink.
Oh, it did.
Oh, well, that was awful.
Well, what were some of the things you're glad have changed, though, that you can think of, that conveniences you have now that really have made a difference? I imagine, of course, electricity probably is the big one.
Yeah, it's the biggest one. And then I think the running water in the house. I can't remember. We always had running water down there on the farm. I can't remember. They had it when I went down there, and they always had it. But I think those are the two main things, and I don't think that the cars have been such a, well, sometimes I think they're more of a detriment than they are a benefit.
What do you think, do you remember what, in your mind, the big change in this part of the country? Is there any particular period that things really seem to change more than?
Yes, Mrs. Carroll and I the other day were talking about it. I said, I'm so glad that I lived in the period that I did. I think that must have been along about, maybe 1930. About the time Roosevelt went in there, he turned things upside down, and I think the whole world was changed about that time.
Now, that brings up another period that I wish you'd talk about, and that's the Depression. It must have been pretty rough.
I didn't even know there was a Depression. Because we grew, see, I was married then, and we grew in our backyard. We had a garden. We grew every little bit thing we could, and I canned everything I could get my fingers on. And we didn't have any grocery bills much. And of course, us being government workers, we went right on with our salary.
Yeah.
Had it not been for seeing other people suffering, and not having the necessities of life, I wouldn't have known there was a Depression. As far as I was concerned, I didn't. But we helped a lot of people during that Depression. We used to, I fed, I don't know how many people I did feed. They'd come, to, they were transients, people going through, and we lived right on the highway in Carthage, and I had, there just wasn't a week that I didn't have 5 or 6 people to feed, that stopped to ask for something to eat, and I'd always give them bacon and eggs. And I'd say, well, now you'll just have to wait till I fry you some bacon and eggs and bread, and I'd give them a good meal.
Now, these were strangers, but you took them into your house,
yeah,
didn't you?
And I was there all alone, too, And I said, one man said, well, do you care if I said, it's cold, awful cold. I said, you go down in the basement and open the door and go in the basement. It's warm there, and we had a lovely, just basement was almost as nice as our house was. And I said, you go in there and you wait till I get your food ready. And I'd take it down on a tray down in the basement to him. Well, I won't let anybody come in this house now. That's just the change, you see, that's in people. And those people were just as harmless as they can be. And one old man said, you don't care if I wash down here, do you? We had a lavatory there and a mirror. And I said, no, if you want to wash and clean up, he says, I'll shave while I'm here. And so he did. And when I took his food down, well, he ate. And so when he got through eating, well, he came back around up to the front door and to thank me for it. And he had on an old ragged overcoat. And I didn't think much about it, and I felt sorry for him because it's a ragged coat. And Wade had just bought a brand new leather jacket and was hanging in the basement. And we never did where the jacket went.
Yeah.
Had it under that coat.
Yeah. Well, but still, that wasn't as serious as some of the things that you read now. Yeah. Now, let's talk a minute about Carthage. Were those big homes into disuse at the time you lived there? Now, of course,
no.
A lot of them have been renovated now. You know, there was a period where they did let them just stand and really deteriorate. But they were still...
oh, yes, people who were living in them, the people who...
A lot of them that built them were
we're still living in them. Yes, that's right. Yes, they were, well, I remember when we moved to Carthage, we didn't want a big house because we didn't, just the two of us, we didn't need a big house.
Where did you live in Carthage?
On Main Street. This was on Main Street. And your aunt lived third door from where we lived when we first moved to Carthage, moved there in a cattle truck. And I can remember Mrs. Davy living in this pretty big house. And the house we lived in was pretty too big house, but it wasn't as nice as some of the others were there on Main Street. And but we didn't live there for a little while till we bought our home, and then we just moved. But those old homes were beautiful, and now, oh my, they've just fixed them up now.
Yeah, I'd say one of the most beautiful towns in the Midwest.
It is.
Carthage
It is. But we always said we wouldn't want to live there if we didn't have a good job. So we could be somebody. I wouldn't want to be there and not be somebody. I picked up, you remember the Bimdecks? But they were insurance people.
I think I've heard the name.
They were prominent people there, old-time people too, like your people were. They, George Bimdeck went to war and he came back, and he had his boy, which was, I imagine, Steve would be about your age. And I noticed in the paper today, he has a little boy, 5 years old, and the little fella got up in a tree.
I saw it this morning's paper.
Was it? And the rope got around his neck and he hanged himself. Hurt me so bad because I knew them so quite well, just the whole family.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed visiting with you. Let's see, today is October the 3rd, 1974.